Greetings, students. I want to continue right along with our discussion of Taoist ethics, and I want to focus it on an expression that is at the heart of what I think of as their very practical and pragmatic ethics, and it's this mysterious expression, Wu Wei, which can be translated as act without acting. Now, what on earth do they mean by that? Well, here's the phrase, Wei Wu Wei. There are the three Chinese characters. And Wei means do, cause, or act. Wu, without, lacking, or not having. And there's Wei again, repeated. Action without action, or acting without acting, or an act without acting, or doing something without doing anything, or however you want to get at it. This phrase is at the heart of the ethics of the metaphysics of the great ordinary. And again, my claim is, it's a very practical thing, a very pragmatic and practical approach to life that has been worked out and followed by many people with great success. Now here's the whole chapter in the Tao Te Ching to give us some context, so let's read through it first. Act without acting, serve without serving, taste without tasting, big, little, many, few, repay hatred with duh. Map difficult with easy, approach great through narrow. The most difficult things in the world must be accomplished through the easiest. The greatest things in the world must be accomplished through the smallest. Therefore the sage never attempts great things, and so accomplishes them. Quick promises mean little trust. Everything easy means great difficulty. Thus for the sage, everything is difficult, and so in the end, nothing is difficult. This is the ethics of the watercourse way, that models itself on water, that flows down, flows across through obstacles, right? Not interfering, not responding in kind. And think about what's behind this. If every action, right, implies an equal and opposite reaction in the phenomenal world, the world of appearance, then in the real world, right, not acting is the spring of true effectiveness. But not acting in a special sense. Right? Wu Wei doesn't simply mean absence of action, like some kind of emptiness, but spontaneous action. You might have to do things to let things happen. Right? It's something like acting through non-interference, through allowing things to take their natural course so that things can be achieved in a natural way. In this way, the philosopher becomes a metaphysician in tune with what is most real, and they let their actions and reactions align with that greater reality. Remember again, we're in the period of the warring states. These are not like some sort of funny nature hermits who never dealt with the real world, right? They were living in the time of the decay of the Zhou dynasty, a horrible period, where the soldiers of one state were only paid off when presenting the severed heads of their enemies to the paymaster, and atrocity answered atrocity, right? A time so horrible that it's only been outdone in our own time in the 20th century. Right? We've done them one better with our Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's, right? And death camps. Yeah. But in this time, too, back then, whole cities would be put to the sword. And they would make soup of their enemies to increase their prestige and frighten others. Again, we shouldn't be too quick to throw stones. Some people think the only reason we dropped a bomb on Japan was to scare Russia. To increase our prestige, we incinerated a city in a second. So, Now, these were the times of the Tao Te Ching, and these were not sort of people wandering around like hippies in the woods, not facing any realities, right? They had to deal with soldiers and horrors and famine and destruction, and in the midst of all this, what answer did they give? Not that of Confucius, right, which was to sort of become very educated and develop yourself and become a highly learned human being. Well, man, he would have thought, right? Lao Tzu seemed to think Confucian preaching to morality had helped trigger the breakdown. They answered instead, in the face of all this, what do? Wu wei. Do nothing. Right? Well, do nothing in the sense that everyone else has been doing it. Right? But it's a kind of an exasperating response, and you get the idea these guys kind of little joy out of ticking people off, right? But in a good way, because they were trying to wake them up and get them to see something, right? Get them to see something. So consider 4 statements with me. In chapter 30, it says, weapons soon turn on themselves. In chapter 57, it says, the more elaborate the laws, the more they commit crimes. In chapter 22, it says, sages do not assert themselves and so stand out. And in chapter 64 it says, act and you ruin it. Grasp it and you lose it. There seems to be a sort of basic principle arising out of the metaphysics of opposites. This belief that reality is made up of these opposites that exist in tension with each other, and out of that tension comes a kind of harmony. And if you push one of the opposites too far one way, it'll rebound by pushing the other way, right? And all of nature seems like this. It's also bound up with the idea of integrity, that everything has its own character, its own weight or inertia, right? Like when you try to kill a living creature, like when you try to kill a wasp and you press down on it, it's going to push back at you, it's going to sting you, it's going to try to resist being deformed and knocked out of shape. And in our time of ecological science, it seems we can understand this too quite well. If you push our environment too far in one way, it's going to rebound in another, trying to seek balance. And so always we find this pattern in nature of action and reaction, of challenge and response. Right? You challenge and you get a response. There's an action and you get a reaction. And everything has its wanting to continue to go its own way, its own integrity, its own self-so, its own way of being. Interfere with something's existence and it resists. As stones resist crushing, as a wasp resists being crushed and stings you, or as a human being gives forth a very complex kind of resistance when you try to make another human being do what they don't want to do, right? This kind of resistance seems to grow stronger as the interference does, until finally one or the other of the opposites is destroyed and the opposition ceases. So humans and human societies have an even more highly articulated and effective capacity for resistance, a really complex and strong right? We might talk of the of Vietnam, if you know about history there, the sort of integrity of Vietnam and how we tried to bend it into our shape and it didn't work, or the of Afghanistan, where we, not only us, but countless countries have tried to push Afghanistan into a shape or form we want it to be in, and it resists and pushes back at us. Challenge, response, action and reaction, over and over again. So how to live? By not feeding into that cycle of actions that cause reactions, of challenges that cause response. Don't act in a way to call forth that reaction. Don't challenge other people in that sense, because they're going to challenge you back. In chapter 22 it says, sages do not contend, and therefore no one under heaven can contend with them. This became really clear to me when I worked as a prison guard. Early in my life, I worked for about a year in the Louisiana State Penitentiary system. And let me tell you, that was a very strange place, right? Full of people who'd committed all kinds of violent crimes. I actually worked in what was called the Diagnostic Reception Unit, where all the new prisoners came to learn how to be prisoners before they were then diagnosed and sent out to different kinds of units. So we had to deal with all kinds of prisoners. And it was a kind of situation that was strange because I was a young kid. I was like 23 years old. There'd be guys in there 40, 50 years old. Some of them spend all their time working out, and they'd just be like big, impressive-looking human beings. And if I was walking by and one of them threw a piece of paper down, I was supposed to tell them to pick it up. And if they didn't pick it up, then they would get put in solitary confinement for not listening to what this punk 23-year-old kid told them, right? And what I began to discover and find out was that the attitude I had toward those prisoners was more important than what I did, right? Or rather, the kind of actions I would take would be different actions depending on the attitude that was behind it. I learned the importance of being instead of doing, of attitude instead of act, and of attraction instead of compulsion. In a sense, I would be telling them, sometimes I would tell them, I'd say, look, dude, I got to ask you to pick that paper up, and you got to pick it up. And you know, and I know that you know that I know that that's just how it is. And personally, I could care less if you pick it up, but I have to ask you. So please, pick it up. Dude, it'd pick it up. Other people, I'd watch my fellow guards. I was learning from them. I was thinking about what I was seeing. They'd be all belligerent. Some people seem to love being able to boss everybody around and sort of tell these other people to do anything they wanted. And if they didn't do it, what the guard said, they'd go into solitary confinement. And the prisoners could develop resistance to those things in quite astonishing ways. So the new guards who were bullies, you'd watch, and sooner or later, there'd be some real effective response to their challenge, such as maybe someone out in the parking lot planting drugs in their car that would get discovered and get them fired, or something like that, right? And it became very clear to me that I had to have a certain attitude toward these people I was dealing with. And this is something I carried into other areas of life. When I was a sergeant in the Army, and then when I was a lieutenant and a captain, I found you had to have a certain kind of attitude that someone could do two apparently identical actions, like order somebody to do something, but the attitude you would have, it would mean that that order was not a challenge calling forth a response, but was literally a way of not ordering. My order was not an ordering. My direction was not a direction. My ruling was not a ruling, because it came out of a different kind of arrangement, a different way of looking at the world. Now, most people acknowledge that positive measures frequently boomerang, but few would acknowledge that inaction could achieve something better than acting, right? That what you want to achieve is an attitude, right? That you want to get people to do things for you, not make them do things for you, because it's part of a general sharing of a common goal and good. And it's not that you never act, but that you act in a certain way. And who you are as you act makes it wu-wei, makes it actionless action, because you break out of the cycle of opposites, where there's challenge and response, action and reaction that build and build and build and build on each other. This is the same kind of philosophy when I studied martial arts, where the master would explain it in just that way, that you never challenge people, that even when you intervene in a violent situation, you do so in a way that has a certain attitude toward it. So I was also a military police officer, and I found that as a police officer, that the most valuable way I could act would be with this sort of non-confrontational stance, right, that I wish was taught more to police officers these days. But nonetheless, as I navigated my way through being a military police officer, I found that how I was as a person was actually more important than what I did. And I could perform an action identical to someone with a different attitude, and it would have enormously different responses. It's important to realize that Taoists are not pacifists, right? When fine weapons are ill-omened tools. when their use is necessary, calm restraint is best. So you got that old example of a madman in a house looking for you. What do? Right? Well, if you can run away, you do. But if they're coming in on your husband or your wife or your children or some innocent person, you can't run away because they'd harm them, then you use the principle of least harm. I would think a good step-in sidekick where you broke their knee would probably take care of that axe problem right away. And that would be to act without acting. That would be to not engage in the cycle of challenge and response on their level, not to pick up an axe and go at them, but to maybe turn and flow and let them go by you and then do a kick real hard onto their leg to make the problem situation calm down. Indeed, you wouldn't want to, as it were, passively interpose yourself in between the madman and their innocent victim, because that would make things worse. After you got your head cut off, they'd get their head cut off, and that's not going to help things, right? Instead, you would use force as a regrettable necessity. So when force is required, when it's a necessity, what we do is almost less important than who we are in what we do. If our attitude is aggressive, we'll spin the wheel of action and reaction a little more. If we show compassion and integrity and regret in our very being, the cycle stops as we realize that a great victory is a funeral ceremony. Now, the point is, though, this can't just be a theory you have. You have to feel it in your very being, having it come out of the meditation experience I talked about in my last lecture. So Wu Wei doesn't mean avoiding all action, but unreal action. Right? Avoiding actions that are keyed into accelerating the plays of opposites instead of trying to harmonize the opposites and come to a kind of balance. Many actions are innocent. Right? Eating food and drinking water, making love, walking and talking, greeting a stranger. But each one of these could also be aggressive things, though they're usually not. And the converse is true. Actions that are usually thought of as aggressive, like military force, might be done in such a way as to perfectly exemplify Wu Wei. The Taoist philosophers know that nonconformity can be as aggressive as insults or silence, that nonconformity can be a shout in the face, a sort of blow that feeds into the cycle of opposites, and that nonviolence, in the sense of being utterly passive to injustice, could be a kind of aggression. So the thread of the Tao is hard to follow. The reality may not always be what it seems. The one who looks most conventional might be at what Zhuangzi calls the pivot point of the Tao, where they watch the yes and no run around, yapping at each other's heels like dogs chasing each other's tails. The yes and the no, the yes and the no. Sometimes you have to say yes, sometimes you have to say no, and you realize, say yes and no is born. Say no and yes is born. And how you address the yes and the no is all important. But I'm also reminded of what it says in number 56. So let's flip there. Number 56. Where it says, to my great chagrin, those who know don't talk, those who talk don't know. So, I hope at best I've been a kind of finger for you, pointing at the moon of Lao Tzu and his beautiful tracks and traces of thought that he's given us in all these Chinese characters that have been translated into these funny English words. I hope you've enjoyed thinking with me about Lao Tzu, and I want to thank you very much for your kind attention.